1493, Chapter 4, Evil Air. This is a pretty fascinating chapter. It's got a lot of interesting different bits of history, again, tied to the English colonies, and it focuses mainly on the effect of mosquito-borne diseases on history and how it's affected it. In his account of his second voyage to the Caribbean, Christopher Columbus wrote that all my people went to shore to settle, and everyone realized that it rained a lot. They became gravely ill from chichionis. The term chichionis refers to a bout of illness that begins with chills, followed by days of high fever and weakness. One of the many diseases that cause chills and fevers is malaria, which is spread through mosquito bites. Did Columbus's men get malaria? If so, they brought it with them. Malaria in humans did not exist in the Americas before Europeans arrived. Historians do not know for certain that the disease that attacked Columbus's people in 1493 was malaria. But if just one of his men had malaria and suffered an attack after landing in Hispaniola, it would have taken only one bite by the right type of mosquito to spread the disease from that victim to others. And those mosquitoes are abundant in Hispaniola. Malaria is responsible for unimaginable suffering. In spite of a world effort to wipe out malaria that began in the 1950s, the disease still affects some 20 million people each year and kills more than 600,000. Most of those who die are children under the age of 5. Those who don't die can be sickened and weakened for months, even with modern medical care. The disease can lurk in the body for months and then emerge with another full-scale attack. So many people in Africa suffer so often from malaria that economists think that the disease has seriously slowed the pace of development there. As it does today, malaria played a huge role in the past. Its role was different from that of other diseases, and maybe larger. When the Europeans brought smallpox and influenza to the Americas, they set off epidemics and sudden outbursts that shot through Indian towns and villages and then faded. Malaria became endemic, which means that it was always present in the landscape. Instead of coming in sudden, severe bursts, malaria was a constant, steady background to life. Malaria and yellow fever, another disease brought to Americas, also carried by mosquitoes, turned the Americas upside down. Before these diseases arrived, the most thickly populated area north of Mexico was what is now the southeastern United States: Georgia, the Carolinas, Alabama. To the south, the wet forests of southern Mexico, Central America, and the Amazon basin held millions of people. After malaria and yellow fever, these previously healthful areas became inhospitable as the diseases thrived. The Indians who lived there fled to safer ground. Europeans who moved into the emptied real estate often died within a year. Just remember how those first 12 years of Jamestown, so many people died. This is probably why. These deaths had a long-lasting effect. Even today, the places where European colonists couldn't survive are poorer than places they found more healthful. So this is referring to, for instance, these states right here tend to be Georgia, Carolinas, Alabama, tend to be economically poorer and have more health problems and poorer school test scores and things like that. That's because Europeans created different institutions in disease areas than in health areas. In healthful areas, they built stable colonies that attracted settlers. The growing populations of these areas included farmers, craftspeople, and business owners. Schools, roads, hospitals, legal codes, and government systems were put in place. Disease areas, however, attracted smaller numbers of Europeans. Not only did it attract, I just want you to note, not only did it attract smaller numbers of Europeans, but less of them survived, so then they weren't having the babies to also increase the population. So that's part of what's going on here for sure. There, the colonizers had little interest in building functioning social and government institutions. Instead, they focused on using native or captive labor to remove resources such as timber, precious metals, or crops that were grown on plantations and exported. Disease played a part in how the labor force in American colonies developed. Because malaria and yellow fever killed European and Indian workers in the tobacco and sugar plantations of the Americas, the colonists imported labor in the form of captive Africans, the human side of the Columbian Exchange. Ecological exchange, in the form of new diseases, led to the economic exchange in the form of slavery. In turn, slavery had political effects that have continued to the present day. It would be an exaggeration to say that malaria and yellow fever were responsible for the slave trade, or that they were the reason that the weak divided 13 colonies won independence from the mighty Great Britain in the Revolutionary War. Yet, as you will see in this chapter, it would not be completely wrong either. Here is a picture of a red blood cell that is being invaded by malaria. The mystery of malaria. In Columbus's day, people did not realize that malaria was a specific disease. They thought of it as a collection of symptoms, and they believed it was caused by marshy or bad air. The English word malaria, in fact, comes from the Italian mal aria, meaning evil or bad air. Malaria, however, is a disease with a complicated life cycle that was not understood until modern times. It is caused by 200 or so species of microscopic parasites that plague countless types of reptiles, birds, and mammals. 4 of those parasite species target human beings, and they are dishearteningly good at their jobs. Each parasite consists of a single cell. It is injected into the human flesh by the bite of a mosquito. Once in the body, the parasite pries open the red blood cells and climbs inside. Floating around the circulatory system like passengers and submarines, their parasites reproduce in huge numbers inside the infected red blood cells. Eventually, they burst out and pour into the bloodstream. Most of the parasites force their way into the new blood red cells, but a few drift in the blood, waiting to be sucked up by a mosquito. When a mosquito takes in the parasite reproduces again inside the insect. Parasites squirm into the mosquito's saliva glands, where they wait to be injected into the new host when the mosquito bites someone. Inside the human body, most of the infected red blood cells release their parasites at about the same time. An infection from a single malaria parasite can produce 10 billion new ones. These huge assaults overwhelm the host's immune system, setting off spasms of chills and fevers. Eventually, the host's immune system beats back the attack. But within days, a new attack takes place because some of the previous wave of parasites have hidden themselves inside red blood cells and produced a new generation of billions of parasites. The cycle repeats itself until the immune system finally defeats the parasite. It may not be a real victory, though. The parasites can hide in other corners of the body, only to emerge again weeks later. The sign of a full-blown malaria is half a dozen episodes of chills and fever, followed by a short period of relief, and then another wave of attacks. The 2 most widespread forms of malaria in humans are caused by the microorganisms Plasmodium vivax and Plasmodium falciparum. Their symptoms are similar, but they have different effects on the body. P. falciparum can cut off the circulation to the kidneys, lungs, brain, and other organs. Organ failure kills as many as 1 out of 10 P. falciparum sufferers. P. vivax doesn't destroy organs, which makes it less deadly, but during its attack, sufferers are weak and vulnerable to other diseases. With both types of malaria, sufferers can be sick for months at a time, and they are infectious during attacks. A mosquito that bites a sick malaria sufferer can transfer the disease to others. Plasmodium microorganisms are tropical and sensitive to temperature. The speed at which they can reproduce inside mosquitoes depends on the temperature of the outside air. As the days get colder, it takes the parasite longer and longer to reproduce until it takes longer than the mosquito's lifespan, which ends the cycle. Practically speaking, P. falciparum cannot survive and reproduce for long below temperatures of about 66 degrees Fahrenheit. P. vivax has a limit of about 59 degrees. P. falciparum thrives in most of Africa. In Europe, it gained a foothold only in the warmest areas: Greece, Italy, Portugal, and southern Spain. P. vivax, however, became endemic. To most endemic means kind of like naturalized. It just started to live there on its own. Became endemic in most of Europe, including cooler northern places such as England, the Netherlands, and southern Scandinavia. P. falciparum came to the Americas from Africa and was spread by Africans. P. vivax came from Europe and was spread by Europeans. This difference had historic consequences. The mosquito connection. Human malaria is carried only by mosquitoes in the Anopheles genus. A genus is a group of closely related species. Landscape engineering by humans in the 16th century England created the perfect conditions for Anopheles mosquitoes and vivax malaria to prosper and to be carried to the Americas by English colonists. The mosquitoes that carry malaria and the disease itself seem to have been rare in England until the later 16th century. At that time, Queen Elizabeth began encouraging landlords to drain marshes and other wetlands to create more farmland. A great deal of drainage work was done in the coastal wetlands of eastern and southwestern England. Much of this low, foggy landscape had been flooded regularly by high tides of the North Sea, which washed away mosquito larvae before they could hatch into adult mosquitoes. The work of draining the wetlands blocked the sea, but left the land dotted with pockets of standing water that were not scoured by the tides. These pools were the perfect habitats for the Anopheles mosquitoes. Might be Anopheles, I don't know, whatever. It's Latin, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Farmers moved into the former marshlands, which were still soggy but now usable for farming. They heated their homes and barns during the cold weather, providing a place for the mosquitoes and the P. vivax parasites inside it to survive the cold weather, ready to breed and spread the following spring. So basically, they moved in. There were a lot of mosquitoes that were surviving anyway because of the pools, no tide to wash them out. And then they built homes and barns that kept them alive throughout the winter. So here we go. Church records. Church records, by the way, are, they didn't have like a public records like we do, like the people didn't have their kids in hospitals, but the church records kept track of everybody's baptism. So every baptism equals like a birth of a baby that lived long enough to be baptized. So church records show that in the 1570s, before the draining of the marshes, baptisms outnumbered burials in 24 wetland parishes. A parish is like a county, but it's a church county. In other words, the population was rising. 2 decades later, with draining in full swing, the trend had been reversed. There are almost twice as many burials as baptisms. So that means for every one person that was born, 2 people died. Population was booming in other parts of England, but these wetland parishes would not return to their earlier rates of growth for almost 2 centuries. Clergymen or priests. Clergymen died at such numbers after being sent to southeast England that the region became known as Kilpriest. And here's a picture of malaria in southeast England. This light color here is like not hospitable, like the malaria doesn't live as well. And here is like the mosquitoes love it, right? So you can see all the dots are wetlands. And here is London, just right in the thick of it. And then all along here, you can see that's a lot, like all of London, Suffolk, Essex, Kent. Then over here, there's a lot of, well, no, those look like just wetlands, but all through here is pretty happy malaria land. And then, but all the way back, it's still least favorable, but there's still, still can find malaria. So then the dots are anybody who was born here, like these are people who went to Jamestown to colonize Jamestown. So you can see it's pretty likely that a lot of these people could have been carrying malaria, which we're about to read about. So right here, all the dots represent people who went to Jamestown. A bunch right here in London, right? Draining the marshes of eastern and southeastern England set off an inferno of vivax malaria. The English wetlands were not the only area affected, however. There is good reason to think that vivax malaria traveled from there to the North American colonies. Information about the early colonists is sketchy and incomplete, but one researcher has estimated that about 60% of the first wave of English immigrants to North America came from 9 counties in eastern and southeastern England, the country's malaria belt. That's this map that we were just looking at, right through here. One example is the 100-plus colonists who began Jamestown. 59 of their birthplaces are known. 37 of those 59 came from malaria-ridden counties. Even if most of them set off from higher inland parts of the counties that had less malaria than the coastal wetlands, some of them would have come from the marshes. Those who didn't come from the malaria zone usually passed through it just before their departure, as their ships waited for weeks or even months at points along the Thames River that were malaria centers. People in the midst of malaria attacks would seem unlikely candidates for a difficult sea voyage. Yet, Plasmodium can hide inside a seemingly healthy person. Colonists could board their ships without symptoms, land in Chesapeake Bay country, and then be struck by teeth-chattering chills and sweat-bursting fevers of malaria. At one point, unfortunately, they could pass the parasite to every mosquito that bit them, and waiting on the east coast of North America were 5 Anopheles species that became the primary spreaders of the disease. Malaria in the Americas. In theory, one person could have established the parasite in the entire North Continent of North America, said Andrew Spielman, a malaria researcher at Harvard School of Public Health. It's a bit like throwing darts. Bring enough sick people in contact with enough mosquitoes, and sooner or later you'll hit the bullseye. You'll establish malaria. Almost certainly some of the colonists at Jamestown, Virginia, were infectious. If the disease started there, it soon spread north. By 1657, John Winthrop, the governor of the Connecticut colony, was recording cases of malaria symptoms. Researchers now think that malaria entered the continent in the 1640s or even earlier. Conditions for the disease were perfect between 1606 and 1612, when low-lying coastal Virginia suffered a series of droughts. These droughts would have turned flowing streams into strings of little standing pools, the ideal habitat for mosquito larvae. The Jamestown settlement was founded in 1607 in the heart of the drought period. Whenever malaria arrived, it rapidly became Whenever malaria arrived, it rapidly made itself at home in Virginia. It became as unavoidable there as it was in the English marshes. Everyone expected new arrivals to get sick and to be fairly useless for the first year until they were, quote, seasoned, unquote. In other words, until they had battled malaria and won. The battle often ended in the cemetery, however. During Jamestown's first half-century, as many as a third of new arrivals died within a year. Actually, if you think about that first, 12 years from that graph that we looked at in the previous chapter, it was more than that. It was something like, 9/10 of the population died in the 12-year period. And that also would have been right in this time frame right here. After that, Virginians learned by trial and error to live with vivax. They avoided marshes and stayed indoors at dusk when mosquitoes are most active. Malaria-related deaths among new arrivals fell from 20 or 30% around 1650 to 10% or lower around 1670. These numbers reflected considerable improvement, but still much suffering. The story of New Edinburgh shows the big role that disease played in colonization. Okay, this is pretty interesting, what happens here. Very similar to, just to preview what we're going to read about New Edinburgh, it's very similar to how the Virginia Company kind of, sent people, except for over a longer period of time, to a situation where they probably weren't going to fare very well. The story of New Edinburgh shows the big role that disease played in colonization. You've probably never heard of New Edinburgh, even though it was a large, ambitious colonial venture. That's because it was also a short-lived disaster. New Edinburgh was meant to be a Scottish colony in Panama. The colony's organizer claimed that the location on the narrow strip of land that separates the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans would let the colony, quote, control, quote, at least two-thirds, unquote, of the Asia trade with Europe. Dazzled by this vision, more than 1,400 people in Scotland put money into a joint stock venture, the same type of business organization that had founded Jamestown. Scotland was a poor nation. Historians estimate that the investments in New Edinburgh amounted to between one quarter and one half of all of the money available in the country. In 1698, 5 ships set sail with 1,200 colonists and a year's food supply. They landed on the coast of Panama and started clearing forests to build the port of New Edinburgh. Just 8 months later, the ragged survivors, fewer than 300 people, bolted for home. So let me see, that's like 1,200. 1/4 of them survived. So just 1/4 of them had survived in 1 year. No, 8 months. Sorry, 8 months. They reached Scotland just days after a second expedition of 4 ships and 1,300 people left for Panama. So they passed this ship going back to Panama. 9 months later, the second expedition also fled. Not 100 people made it home. So that's 1 out of every 13 people survived. So that means 12 people out of every 13 people died. Lost with the dead was every penny invested in the venture. Why did New Edinburgh fail? There were many reasons. Planning to trade with local Indians, the colonists had stuffed their ships with Scotland's finest products: woolen hose and blankets, ornamental wigs, and 25,000 pairs of leather shoes. Alas, it proved difficult to sell warm socks and ishy blankets in the tropics. Meanwhile, hard tropical rains washed away the colonists' supplies and their efforts to farm. To make matters worse, Spain, which had already established colonies in Central America and the nearby Caribbean islands, periodically attacked the new rivals. The main causes of the disaster, however, were 2 mosquito-borne illnesses, malaria and yellow fever, along with dysentery, a disease not carried by mosquitoes. Dysentery is caused by drinking bad water, and basically people get really bad diarrhea and they die of dehydration. Records kept by the colonists report dozens of deaths each week. The first time Spain assaulted New Edinburgh, its soldiers found 400 fresh graves. They had been filled by victims of diseases that had come to the Americas from Europe and Africa. Back in Scotland, the calamity of New Edinburgh set off riots. Much of the country's capital, that is, its cash available for investment, had been wiped out. At the time, England and Scotland were separate countries, although they had shared a monarch. England, the bigger partner, had been pushing for complete union for decades. Scots had resisted, fearing they would become a minor afterthought in an economy dominated by London. Now, as part of the union agreement, England promised to repay the people who had invested New Edinburgh. The result was the formation of Great Britain, quote, with assistance from the fevers of Panama, unquote, in the words of historian J.R. McNeil in his book Mosquito Empires. And there's a picture of one of those little buggers right there. Okay, so this is just, I'm going to read this little aside. You can tell it has like a darker color paper. So this is just a personal account of from somebody's diary. This guy who was a really successful planner, he had gotten malaria. His whole family had gotten it in 1757, but his baby daughter, Suki, also had it, and it's just his diary about it. The suffering of Suki Carter. Landon Carter had a prosperous Virginia plantation about 60 miles north of Jamestown. He was a devoted father who agonized as malaria repeatedly struck his family in the summer and fall of 1757. Worse affected was his infant daughter, Suki, who was racked by bouts of chills and fever. Landon recorded her struggle in a diary. December 7. Suki looks badly all this evening with a quick pulse. December 8. Tis her usual period of attack, which is now got to every fortnight, 2 weeks. Seems brisk and talks cheerfully, her fever not higher. December 9. Continues better, though very pale. December 10. Suki, a fever early and very sick at her stomach and headache. This fever went off in the night. December 11. The child no fever today, but I thought her pulse a little quick at night. December 12th. Suki's fever rose at 1 in the night. This child dangerous ill at 12. Dead, pale, and blue. To live in Virginia, a heartbroken Carter wrote, quote, "It is necessary that a man should be acquainted with the affliction, and 'tis certainly nothing short of it to be confined a whole year in tending one's sick children. Mine are now never well." Unquote. Suki died the following April, just short of her 3rd birthday. We're going to end this part right here. This will be our part 2, and there's actually then a 3rd part about the Revolutionary War.